And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by ABSA CIB, honoured as the best research house for the 8th consecutive year at the JSE Spire Awards 2024. Good evening. Welcome to The Money Show. I'm Stephen Grootes. As we go to air tonight, 5 minutes before 5 or so on SENS this evening, ArcelorMittal issuing a statement saying they've decided to defer the closure of their Longs steelmaking business until the end of August. Essentially, the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, giving them a cash injection of 1.6 billion rand. There might well be some rejoicing on the streets of Newcastle in KwaZulu-Natal tonight. You can imagine how the mood has been in that community. So many people dependent on this factory to keep going to provide for themselves and their families. The problem, of course, is, and you don't even need me to spell it out for you, the long-term future of this plant is simply not assured. This is 1.6 billion rand, I presume, to cover salaries and other essentials until the end of August. What does 1.6 billion rand buy you? What happens when it's gone? And that, I suppose, is going to be one of the questions. And industrial policy with regards to steel seems to have been, depending on who you speak to, and I'll be polite here, very, very difficult, but a little bit of a hodgepodge and people trying to do different things, which in the end seem to compete with each other. Unfortunately, it is one of those moments where industrial policy is, in fact, very, very difficult, and it's made so difficult at the moment simply because of a lack of demand for steel. Well, we'll try and keep you up to date with the latest on that and bring you as much reaction as we can to that breaking story. The other big story, of course, is around the budget. We'll update you on that in just a moment with Tsidi Medea from Eyewitness News. Dion George, the Minister of Environment, he's Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. He'll be on your radio about an hour from now. He's agreed, he has essentially said Eskom can continue to break the law with regard to emissions for 8 power stations for a period of 5 years for some and 10 for others. He issued a statement last week that gave me the sense he was going to go the other way on this. He slammed Eskom, saying that they had always broken their public commitments to reduce emissions. He made the point that the economy needs to move away from fossil fuels. His job is, of course, environmental affairs. So I find it interesting, and one of the questions I will put to him is whether or not he's actually changed his view from when he issued that statement last week to the decision that he's made this week. And then, of course, in the United States, do I need to remind you about what's happening on those markets there, particularly because of what we're expecting from the US President Donald Trump on Wednesday? He calls it Liberation Day. Difficult to know exactly what he's going to announce, but it is going to be around tariffs. Lots to come. Good to hear from you tonight on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, it does seem now that the ANC and the DA are moving closer to some kind of agreement towards a budget. Technically speaking, Parliament has to vote on a budget on Wednesday. On Friday, it appeared talks between the two had broken down. Now it seems they're talking together again. Tsidi Medea, Associate Politics Editor at EWN. Tsidi, good evening. Good to have you in the Money Show studio again. The proposed VAT increase was a huge factor in the breakdown of these relationships between the DA and the ANC. Have they reached an agreement? Is it possible to know? Is this dance going to go for a little while?
Good evening, Stephen. I don't even know if that proposed VAT increase was actually the huge issue. It was the opportunity that allowed for issues to be ventilated. I think it created the perfect storm for the issues that have been brewing, bubbling under to finally be brought to the fore. They are now talking. They've had a weird weekend of back and forth, sleepless nights. At this point, I'm now eagerly waiting to see what happens. Fikile Mbalula has a briefing at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. John Steenhuisen has one at 8:30 in the morning. So I'm like, interesting. I wonder if they're going to one-up each other or if they will speak from the same hymn sheet, if you may. I highly doubt it, though. I think a lot will still happen before Wednesday. Never mind tomorrow's Finance Committee meeting.
There's a lot going on here. So there's that committee meeting tomorrow. People will have to give instructions to their representatives on that committee about what to do. Unless, of course, say the DA members just don't pitch. But that seems unlikely. Everyone will want a voice on this, including other parties that really have no prospect of joining the coalition, but they'll still have their say.
Absolutely. It's such an interesting time, right? So I think the DA will pitch. I don't think it's like the DA to not pitch. I mean, even when they had the fights, when the budget 2.0 was happening, some people believe that the DA would not pitch. It pitched. It does its duty to country and otherwise. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in that sitting tomorrow, because it kind of signals what to expect as far as Wednesday is concerned. I'm expecting the smaller parties, Stephen, to be more influential than we expect them to be. I think it's a numbers game that we're dealing with now. So everybody understands that they matter. Even those that have just 2 seats, they know that they're important now. Their time is now. So I don't write off even the smaller parties.
The ANC and the DA, do they need each other in some way here?
It depends on what you're asking, doesn't it? It literally isn't. It's not black and white. It's not clean cut.
The ANC and the DA isn't?
Stephen, I think to some degree they might need each other, but in other shapes, in other forms, it doesn't. I think the struggle for me has been the ANC itself has many schools of thought about what is ideal. There are some who, again, I say, were part of engineering the GNU, who today call me and say, we need to get out. We cannot stay. It can't continue. But the DA also benefits from suddenly getting a national footprint. With the impact of being in the GNU and the DA is good for the DA ahead of local government elections, which I don't think are next year, but I think are 2027. And I do think that that'll benefit the DA greatly to stay in the GNU, right? Does it benefit the ANC to continue with the DA? And I think that there's some in the ANC who are realizing that it doesn't. Because the DA does recognize that they are competitors and has been operating exactly like that. And that's why you often see the DA in the public domain being very vocal about what they agree or disagree with, and being very vocal about what they celebrate and claim as their victories.
Tidi Madia, thank you very much indeed. 8:30 the DA, 9 o'clock-ish. For Kile Mbalula, the Secretary-General of the ANC. Well, meanwhile, the University of Northwest Business School Policy Uncertainty Index has reached its highest level since 2016, partly because of the situation around the budget here, partly because of the situation in the US, where the President Donald Trump has said he'll announce a comprehensive set of tariffs on Wednesday. Professor Raymond Parsons is the economist at Northwest University Business School. Professor Parsons, good evening. Your index is incredibly high at the moment, obviously a confluence of our budget issues and Trump's tariffs. Put the two together, I can't remember a time when things both here and overseas were more uncertain.
Yes, indeed, Stephen. I think we must allow ourselves to think of this year as the new normal of economic uncertainty until several of these issues are resolved. And as you rightly say, there is an unusual intersection in the past couple of months between the global factors and, in particular, if you take the United States actions and certain developments on the domestic front, such as the budget uncertainty and so forth. And I think from the United States angle, as a point of departure, I think the issue here is simply that after 80 years of a rule-based, multi-sectoral sort of trading system in the world, we are now seeing that being abandoned. And of course, for small open economies, that's quite important that we could be part of the WTO, that is the World Trade Organization, which seeks to establish the fair trade rules. And many of the issues which are now a conflict issue on a bilateral issue between President Trump and, for example, Canada or the EU are actually issues that ought to have been sorted out at the World Trade Organization. But both China and the United States have steadily distanced themselves from the rule-based system, and now we've reached a point where I think from the United States point of view, it's a purely bilateral and not a multilateral issue in order to further their particular interests. And of course, as you rightly say, unfortunately or fortunately, some of our own decisions are feeding into this global situation. So there is an unusual intersection between what's happening globally and what we are doing or not doing from a domestic point of view.
I mean, the funny thing about this, and I don't think this will happen, but I mean, the funny thing is that the ANC and the DA could all come out tomorrow hand in hand, arm in arm, singing together. I don't know what song, but certainly singing the same one. And Trump's tariff announcement on Wednesday could turn out to be a completely damp squib. that would bring your index not down completely, of course, because I think as long as Trump is in office, it will be high, but it would bring it down significantly quite quickly.
Well, we hope so. If the right decisions are taken or if reasonable decisions are taken in the White House and reasonable decisions are taken by the GNU, I like to say that our debate here today, I think, is very much when we talk about the GDP, it's now for South Africa not only the gross domestic politics, it's also the gross domestic product. They're two sides of the same coin. So hopefully we'll know in the next day or so these convergence of decisions, both in the White House and in the GNU, whether domestically there is a test of the maturity of the GNU to come up with a sensible and a credible fiscal package that will address the issues of our sustainability on the fiscal front and economic growth. But I would also counsel that sometimes you need to unpack the merits of the deal. Any compromise may not be as good as the best compromise, so no deal may be better than a bad deal. So I think all our eyes are on the hope that our political leadership in all the parties will put the economic interests of the country as a high priority and arrive at a credible compromise that will build confidence and then ultimately will also reduce uncertainty from a domestic point of view. Because nothing is more important for South Africa now than to develop the buffers and the resilience we need in order to deal with economic shocks over which we don't have much control. So it's tremendously important to have a fiscal policy emerge and a budget policy now emerge that will underpin our economic recovery and push us to the 3% growth rate that the GNU itself would like to see. And I think that's the most important message that's got to come out of our domestic decision-making about the current budget.
You have 9 years of data now. Is it possible to know what high levels of uncertainty in your index, what impact those high levels of uncertainty on your index have on business activity? So one presumes that the higher level of policy uncertainty, the less investment by business, and thus less economic activity. But I imagine it's almost impossible to calculate that.
Well, I think what I try to do with this particular proxy index is to look at a couple of variables that give us some idea that when there is a high level of this policy and economic uncertainty, it does have an inhibiting effect on your growth, on your spending, and on your employment. There's no doubt if it persists and you don't take remedial action, then that's what's going to happen. Now, just briefly to say, of course, we know that last year we only grew at 0.6% GDP. This year we're looking for a modest 1.6%. I wish we would get out of worrying about our future with just these decimal points, but that's where we are. Now, the issue has got to be, if we want to do better than 1.6% GDP growth this year, you're simply going to have to take action and expedite and accelerate the structural reforms that must come through in the budget as well, to say that's the path that the GNU is committed to, and it will now commit itself to making sure that the things happen that will accelerate growth, because ultimately the best answer to external factors over which you do not have much control is a bigger, stronger, and better economy domestically. And that is the challenge that's facing the GNU, particularly around the decisions embodied in this current budget.
Professor Raymond Parsons, thanks very much indeed at Northwest University Business School. You with the Money Show. Well, that policy index will go in one direction or another, partly because of what Trump announces during his big tariff announcement on Wednesday. But he also seems to have some animus or some spite for South Africa. Peter Worthington is a senior economist at ABSA CIB. Peter, good evening. Good to talk to you again. There's been a lot of talk recently that as South Africa, we might get kicked out of AGOA. In fact, you suggest the pain may not end there.
I think that's right. And actually, at the end of the day, when you really look at the benefits that we got from AGOA compared to what would have been the default option before Trump came into office, they weren't really that large. If we were kicked out of AGOA before, we would have moved from an average import-weighted tariff of 1%, from 0.01% under AGOA up to 1%. A little different if you include specific anti-dumping trade remedies, but still a very marginal sort of deterioration in the tariff barrier that we would have faced for our exports to the U.S. But this is a brand new world. I mean, Trump has abandoned most favored nation principles for trade, as Professor Parsons was describing. And in fact, we've already been hit with some really large tariffs coming through on our exports of autos and metals, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second, and also threats of reciprocal tariffs. And those could be quite damaging for South Africa's food and beverage exports. This idea that President Trump has that he's going to charge an eye for an eye tariff. We obviously have higher tariffs on our food and wine imports than the U.S. charges, so reciprocal tariffs would hit that industry hard. Motor vehicles, 25%. That's tough for our manufacturers. And it's particularly tough because every other motor vehicle exporting country in the world is going to be faced with the same tariffs. So it won't be that easy for our motor vehicle manufacturers to find new export markets because competition will be increasing. For metals, the situation is a bit different. Trump announced 25% blanket tariffs on all imports of steel and aluminium. Those are sort of our third and fourth biggest export product lines to the States. But we already faced very high tariffs on those goods. Trump in his first term imposed these ad valorem anti-dumping duties. And so now these new tariffs just kind of level the playing field. And so in one sense, we're now more equal with other exporters to the U.S. But the thing is that they're all very large, big exporters of metals, South Korea, China, Canada, et cetera, et cetera. And to the extent that they are now shut out of U.S. markets, they're going to be looking for new export markets elsewhere. So more competition for South African producers in these other export markets.
On the same day that the IDC gives 1.6 billion rand to ArcelorMittal. The other problem, I mean, so much is going to happen now, but just the level of uncertainty. I mean, if Trump were to announce reciprocal tariffs, so every tariff that is imposed on the U.S. is then imposed by the U.S. in return, my understanding is that's hundreds of thousands of items. I mean, it just would become very difficult to enforce. The uncertainty would sort of multiply, and everything seems to be changing. And this is very difficult for business, no matter where you are.
It's really difficult for business because you don't know, even if they announce a program on Wednesday, you don't know if it's going to be rescinded on Thursday. You have no idea at the moment, and so it's very difficult for businesses to plan. Trump has recently hinted that some countries might get breaks. We don't know which countries. We don't know if the countries that get breaks are going to change on the Friday, or I would say that the policymaking in the U.S. currently in respect of tariffs is very chaotic. And that uncertainty weighs on businesses. You just hunker down and you wait for clarity to emerge because you can't make decisions when uncertainty is so high.
Peter Worthington, really appreciate the time tonight. Thank you. Senior Economist at ABSA CIB.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Peter Brook, Portfolio Manager at Old Mutual Investment the Old Mutual Investment Group. Peter, good evening to you. I imagine you've been nodding your head along a little bit to some of these conversations. I mean, as I speak to you now, gold is at $3,126 or so. U.S. markets are heading down. It's all about Trump and tariffs.
The gold story is just so phenomenal. I mean, so best two performers today were Harmony and Sibanye. But if you actually look at their month-to-date performances, those two shares have done 48%.
Wow, that's incredible.
And, I mean, well, just to put it in context, gold shares now are about 12% of the JSE if you use the shareholder-weighted index. And generally South African funds have tended to own a bit less gold than the benchmark. So the average fund has got around 7.5%. I can remember not that long ago where those numbers was 2% of the benchmark and the average fund held 1%. So a really big swing in terms of the impact on our market, and then obviously good news for the holders of those shares.
It would seem, obviously, that trying to do any kind of business with the United States is going to be fraught for the next little while. All of this is going to have such a big impact on the global economy. And from what we can see, Trump is not paying attention to stock markets this time around.
That feels right. I mean, I think he's being driven more by his policy and less about a need to be liked. And if you think about it, he can't get a second term. So actually, he's sort of rolling the dice. He's not going to be re-elected. So he's almost freer to act this time round than previously, where he was expecting to be to get back in again.
And then ArcelorMittal tonight, a send statement this evening. They're keeping their long steel business open another 6 months or so to the end of August. The IDC's giving them a cash injection of 1.6 billion rand.
Yeah, it's tricky. I just feel a bit irritable about it, quite frankly. I mean, we've watched South Africa, sort of the policies that have hampered our industrial companies in terms of energy and rail and all of these different issues. And then we have a crisis which arrives, and then we sort of try and stick a finger in the dike. Just to put it in context, the IDC owns 8.3% of Sasol. They own 53 million shares. Not too long ago, that was worth 32 billion rand. Today, it's worth just a bit less than 4 billion rand. So the IDC and what are we doing with this money and what's the future return from it, it feels too little too late, and we need to be much clearer on our overarching industrial strategy.
Peter, thank you. Before I let you go, one last comment, if I may. You've been a very big part of the Money Show for many, many years. You've been an important voice on this show. I don't know if you're aware of how important it's been. I know you're moving on to different things and we won't hear from you as often. But for all the people who've been listening to you over the years, to listen to you, giving them so much of your time and your wisdom, thank you very much. And from the Money Show, Peter, good luck for the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. I've enjoyed being on it.
Peter Brook, thanks very much indeed. The portfolio manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group, for the last time as a regular on The Money Show.
WhatsApp Stephen
on 072
702
1702.
Well, good to hear from you this evening. You can call as well. Is the IDC making the right choice by putting 1.6 billion rand into the long steel business at ArcelorMittal to keep them going until the end of August? 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. An extraordinarily difficult decision one way or another. But you heard the comment from Peter Brook there earlier about how much money can sort of just go if you don't do this correctly. You heard earlier the analysis about what's coming out of the Trump administration, what that's going to do to international steel supplies, because people who are used to trading and used to selling in the US will be looking for other markets at a time when there's a glut of steel pushing the price down on global markets. Very difficult issue. Well, more evidence coming out today about who's really running our smaller businesses and how they're doing it. Last week on the Money Show, you heard around how 70% of startups in South Africa fail. New research that was conducted by Worldwide Works on behalf of ShopRite shows the problems people, and it seems particularly women, are having in accessing capital, keeping the companies going, getting them particularly to the next scale. Maude Modise is the Enterprise and Government Relations Executive at the ShopRite Group. Maude, good evening. You commissioned this research. You wanted to find out what's standing in the way of entrepreneurial activity. We keep hearing, we see the success stories of some businesses. We hear the stories of others. What were the major trends that stood out for you? And clearly access to funding is still a major problem.
Stephen, yes. Just to maybe take a step back in terms of our reasoning of why we commissioned the report, looking into the role SMMEs play within the economy, obviously their contribution to economic growth and job creation within the economy, there is no way that we can't support their development, because obviously they will help us tackle other issues like the unemployment problems that we have within the South African space. But our objective with this report was really to gain meaningful insights into how corporate South Africa can better support small businesses to overcome barriers, scale effectively, and obviously access new markets. And we surveyed around 800 entrepreneurs and asked various things that are related to gender, age, geography. Are these SMMEs or entrepreneurs educated? Where did they work before they actually got into entrepreneurship? And some of the key takeouts from there is really we need to focus specifically around women and the critical need for targeted support for female entrepreneurs in order to improve access to market for them, and obviously put in specific resources to assist them with that.
There does seem to be a gender gap between men and women when it comes to funding. I mean, and this probably gets to some of the networks people have, maybe some of the ways their applications or their informal approaches for capital are sort of dealt with. Is that still a big issue?
It seems like it, Stephen. A lot of the research that we did within this report actually shows businesses, women actually play quite a pivotal role in smaller businesses. Those are businesses that, small and micro, that employ around, let's say, people. They own 51% of those businesses. But as the business continues to grow and the turnover continues to expand, they're employing more people. As you get to the end goal, where you're looking at about businesses that employ between 50 to 200 people, then that number of women-owned business participation actually decreases to around 12.6%. So that obviously gives you a certain view around how do you go from 51% to 12.6%, which are challenges related to limited access to funding, limited access to networks, even for mentorship opportunities, but also bespoke solutions that really speak to issues that could help women businesses expand to certain levels.
I mean, there may even be things in the other jobs, the other duties that women have in society that are sort of, that they sometimes have no choice around. It's very complicated. I was fascinated to see 65% of smaller firms are based in Gauteng and the Western Cape. Just those two provinces. It tells you how difficult entrepreneurial activity is in other parts of the country.
Right, so 65.9%, so basically 66% of SMMEs that we surveyed were based within Western Cape and Gauteng. That actually shows you that within the economic hubs, there's a lot of SMME and entrepreneurial activity. But once you get out of the other, into the other provinces, which is around the other 7 provinces, that's where you find the differential of where the other 34% are sitting, which actually tells you that instance, they only form part of 1% of the entrepreneurial landscape within the South African space that we looked into. So looking at those under-resourced provinces and provinces where there isn't a lot of economic activity, we need to do a lot more work in terms of looking at entrepreneurial activities within that space and how to actually make it an attractive opportunity for entrepreneurs that are within the underserved provinces. I
mean, I'm sure infrastructure is a big part of it and the sort of urban nature of the Western Cape and Gauteng. But I mean, KZN has massive urban centres. That can't be the only reason.
It can't be, but I mean, within those centres or economic hubs, there's a lot of logistic support that is obviously much easier. Imagine somewhere like within the Northern instance, if you're in a rural area, for instance, whichever province we're looking into, if you're within a rural area, it is obviously much more difficult to get logistics within check so that you can transport your goods to certain locations. You actually need to get your products or your goods to economic hubs in order for you to obviously get that product out there in the market. So, I mean, even if you look at it from a resourcing perspective, getting a product from one rural province to an economic hub, the cost thereof also actually attributes to the cost of the product as well. So those are the things that we need to look into from an infrastructure perspective.
We keep being told that government and everybody is trying to create a more enabling environment for smaller businesses. I don't know if smaller businesses and their owners really feel that. I mean, there is so much that needs to be done. We were told at one point the magic bullet will be solving the electricity problems. We've pretty much done that. We still see the same scale of problem. I mean, it just tells you how much needs to be done. Where would you focus? I mean, in terms of, fixing this, creating a more enabling environment, I mean, it's not an easy question. It's a sort of impossible question I'm asking you, really, I suppose, to be fair. But I mean, there must be one or two things that really struck you from this research.
So one, Stephen, it's really around bringing together different ecosystem players to enable this and make this work. At the end of the day, ShopRite is a retailer. We're good at selling whatever's on the shelf. But there's other people who are good at mentorship and other opportunities that are within that space, bringing together different people to provide the networking opportunity. So I think it's a ecosystem problem that everybody obviously needs to come together and try and solve this issue. But from a ShopRite perspective, I mean, a few years ago, we launched ShopRite Next Capital, which is a business division that is dedicated specifically to equip and assist small businesses with tools and resources in order for them to thrive within the retail space. We look at stuff like working capital assistance. We look at PR and marketing support, looking at also how do we assist SMMEs with packaging and labeling support. So within our different environments, there are definitely certain things that we can do to enable SMMEs to thrive within the different spheres that we're operating in.
Maud Budisep, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Enterprise and Government Relations Executive at the ShopRite Group on The Money Show tonight.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by ABSA CIB. Honored as the best research house for the 8th consecutive year at the JSE Spire Awards 2024.
Well, good to hear from you this evening, as always, on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. The gold price just extraordinary at the moment. As I speak to you now, $3,116.11 an ounce. It was just 17 days ago that gold broke through $3,000 an ounce for the first time. The reason, of course, the short-term reason at least, is no secret. The primary reason, the promise by the US President Donald Trump to impose that comprehensive set of tariffs on Wednesday. He calls it Liberation Day. People, it seems, are looking for a safe haven. Peter Armitage is the CEO of Anchor Capital. Peter, good evening. I mean, I remember speaking to you not so long ago when we went past $3,000, and there was a sense of anticipation gold would stay high for a while, but it's raced to 3,100 incredibly quickly.
Yeah, Stephen, I think things gather momentum, and there's a lot of FOMO around, so people buy because it's going up. I think if you think about it, a lot of what Trump is doing will push inflation up. So typically, if you're nervous about the equity market, you might want to go into bonds. But higher inflation is not good for bonds. So it leaves you with few other choices. So gold on a comparative basis is looking like a nice, safe place to be.
How big a factor is just the short-termism of the tariffs that are due to be announced on Wednesday? I make this point because you have a US president now who is quite capable of saying he's going to announce something big and it turns out to actually be a damn squib, or to say he's going to announce something big and announce something that's even bigger. So presumably the biggest factor of the moment is Wednesday.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you get a sense of people going, I just don't want to play this game. You just have no idea what the next move is. And going, let's just park in gold and wait and see where the madness ends. Because as you say, the complete unpredictability of what's happening is one of the root causes. And, uncertainty just scares people away from risk assets.
At some point, someone somewhere is going to make the claim that this is a new normal for gold. We know in commodity markets that there is normally a cycle. Gold has a cycle. Do you expect that cycle to return at some point? I mean, we may be 3.5 years away, but do you expect the gold cycle to return at some point, or is there any kind of prospect that this is a new normal? And I presume a new normal for gold at this level would be quite a scary prospect because of what it would mean for the world.
Yeah, so I think there's no such thing as a new normal in commodity markets. There never has been. If you go and look at any graph of virtually any commodity, there's cycles. This one is being driven a lot by inflation. I think as you head towards, Trump is doing what he has to do. As you move further into the end of the year, you're probably going to get more market-friendly principles. If the market really does crash, that he is sensitive to that. And the other thing to remember from a technical point of view is tariffs have a once-off impact on inflation. So they might push inflation up 1 or 1.5% this year, but inflation is a rate of change. So next year, inflation will come back down again, which is less favorable for gold. So you certainly are in a momentum-driven gold rise. That can still go up a fair bit. Gold is now very expensive compared to history. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the highest ever was 3,800. So it's not to say it can't go up some more, but it's, just remember that gold, it can easily come off 10, 15% if things normalize and sentiment changes. If you think about how sentiment's changed in the past 2 or 3 weeks, These things happen pretty quickly. So, the right answer is to be diversified.
We heard a commentary earlier this evening that there's at least one gold share on the JSE that's up 48% on a month, which is just an incredible number. But this is all kind of gets to that's basic in future earnings. And to try and work out where gold's going to be a year from now is always impossible, but is now, I would imagine, more so. So for you, there could still be shocks in both directions to come, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, you must remember a gold share, you're buying leveraged exposure to the gold price. So, if gold comes off 10%, and we're not predicting a big dip in gold at the moment, but we've just got to look at what the possibilities. Gold shares will come off dramatically more than the gold price. So you've just, it's a bit like taking a leveraged bet or a CFD on the gold price.
I suppose then the next question really becomes around how people are going to manage this entire situation. There are going to be some people who are just going to be enthusiastic. They'll keep piling in. Something will happen. Eventually the market will probably find some kind of sense and kind of start to pull away from it. But it does, and I can't recall a time when one person in one office, and I'm talking specifically about Trump, would have had so much influence over something as fundamental as gold. Usually it's been a confluence of factors or a confluence of people or a set of actors kind of, working, I suppose, against each other. This is the actions of one person by and large. This must be almost unique.
I think it is a unique time in history, certainly in recent history. But a big factor is that the Republicans have got both centers of power in the states. So there isn't a Congress to stop or a Senate to stop something happening to get some balance. And I think people underestimated, and certainly we did. People didn't think that the U.S. president has as much power as he's got. And he's certainly one of those people, if you disagree with anything he has to say, you get completely sidelined. So you get, a lot of Republicans who might not agree with what he's doing. They kind of bow their heads and keep quiet when things are happening. So, very forceful personality in the most powerful country in the world, which has 40% of the world's military spend. So it really is, it makes the world seem like a small place.
Peter Armitage, thanks very much indeed, CEO at Anchor Capital. Really do appreciate the time. It is extraordinary just to think the impact that this has had on gold prices, how quickly it's happened. To try and sort of do the maths on how long it will last, of course, has been said many times, is just impossible. But certainly there'll be a lot of people in the gold markets who are feeling very confident tonight.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Just a reflection on the negotiations that seem to be underway between the ANC and the DA, and the fact that we do have these two press conferences. You heard Sidi Madia making the point. The DA is at 8:30. The ANC is at 9 o'clock tomorrow. And it would seem to me that for both of them, there is a lot that will, this is just my view now, bind them together. On the one side, you will have the ANC that has already taken a decision to work with the DA and other parties in the national coalition. To walk away from that now would be very difficult, could also lead to a huge conversation within the party about who to work with, which would, open the door to MK and the EFF. Difficult for both, if you ask me. For the DA too, though, the risk for them, I would think, is that they've told their voters pretty bluntly that the reason they're working with the ANC is to stop the ANC from working with the EFF and MK, to open the door and then allow them to go and work with to allow the ANC to work with the EFF and MK might be a suggestion that the DA was wrong in the first place. The same, of course, goes for the ANC. And this does make me think that they might just strangely, to save face, to save one's reputation, to justify the decisions that were made during the elections and after the elections last year, we might just find that actually they all come out talking peace. They may not. This is South African politics, after all. Talking of which, we'll be speaking to Dion George. He's the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in just a moment. He's from the DA as it happens, but we'll be talking about his decision to grant Eskom 8 of their power stations more permission to basically be exempt from emissions targets, essentially to break the law. Also, don't forget a book. It's a fascinating book. It's called License to be Bad, How Economics Corrupted Us. Or if you want to put it another way, why it's true that people who are younger than you are more selfish than you. That's their thesis, not mine. I'm obviously young. You with The Money Show, 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by ABSA CIB, honoured as the best research house for the 8th consecutive year at the JSE Spire Awards 2024. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of the programme. In a moment, Dr. Dion George, the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, his decision around Eskom and emissions targets is a crucial decision in many ways for the economy of the country, but also all part of the transition towards other sources of energy, moving away from coal. In a few moments, we'll talk about the book License to be Bad, How Economics Corrupted Us. I suppose one way of looking at it is that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be selfish. That's what the book's author says, not me. I mean, I may or may not agree. It's hard to know. But the point is that essentially it would seem that economics has pushed us as human beings in one way. And if you look at how we interact with each other now and how that's changed, you know, I say in the old days, I realize how old I sound when I say that, but most economic interactions would involve face-to-face, person-to-person contact. Even if you weren't paying with cash, paying with a check or something like that, if you were in a shop, if you went to go and make a payment in a bank, if you got paid at work, if you went to go and pay your rent. I remember queuing in a bank to pay my rent with a check. Obviously never will have to do that again. But there was that kind of interaction. Now, of course, things very, very different. Well, we'll look at that in the next little while as well. And then Khanki Matabane, he is the president of the Black Business Council. He'll tell you about his career journey, how I make my money, on The Money Show this evening from 7:30. Looking forward to that conversation. He's played a very interesting role in business organizations at very interesting times. So I think that is going to be one of those conversations that could actually be very, very useful. And just looking forward to how that pans out. You know, of course, and you've heard from people who've made the point about how interesting and important business organizations are. From time to time, you'll hear them on the program. They'll be making the point about what they're fighting for and what they're trying to change. Well, you'll hear from Khanki Matabane from 7:30 this evening. Good to hear from you. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567, and of course voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, the Forestry, Fisheries and Environment Minister, the DA's Dion George, confirming today he's granted 8 Eskom coal-fired power stations permission, I suppose you would say, to break emissions targets for periods of between 5 and 10 years. Eskom had applied for longer periods for the 8 power stations. They are scattered in different parts of the country, primarily the north. It's the Medupi, Matimba, Duva, Majuba, Matla, Tutuka, Letabo and Kendall power stations. Well, the Minister, Dr. Dion George, joins us now. Minister, good evening to you and thank you for your time. I mean, technically, I presume each of these is a different application, but let me just start with the general point. Why have you allowed Eskom, I suppose, to essentially break the law for between 5 and 10 years?
Well, good evening. Yes, it is a complex situation, which I think everybody knows already. We have got minimum emission standards and Eskom is not complying with them. Now, the effect really is that if I had not given exemptions to Eskom, tomorrow they would be illegally operating the power stations and they would have to switch them off. And that is 29,000 megawatts of electricity. So, I mean, I can't see how we would want to have the lights off in that way. It is just not tenable. But at the same time, of course, we have a constitutional right to clean air. So what I did was I did give exemptions to Duva and Matla until 2034 because that's when they're decommissioning. And it wouldn't have made sense from a financial perspective for Eskom to do a significant amount of work on them because they are decommissioning, and I did look at their financials, and, you know, you have to be sensible. On the other stations that you mentioned, it is so that they wanted a much longer period. For example, for Kendall, they wanted exemptions until 2044, and on other stations until 2051. So they really wanted a very long period until their decommissioning, or according to them. But I did not permit that. I gave them 5 years. And I think that's very reasonable. And it does not need to lead to load shedding. I've checked it up very carefully. I was very cautious with my ruling. Also, very importantly, we must have the just energy transition. So we know Eskom has been holding South Africa to ransom for a long time, and they've not acted as they should have, and they've had previous exemptions. But we can accelerate the green energy, and Eskom gets in the way. So also in my ruling, I've indicated that they must allow more independent power producers. They must accelerate the transmission lines because we need those, and they are getting in the way. And also, I've made very strict conditions in terms of health interventions that must happen in communities. Also, they must green as well in the communities that are close to the power stations. And I have made very tight deadlines, and I have made it crystal clear to Eskom that I will hold them to account. They have responded to say that they will obviously review the decision I've made, have a look and see. I want to have an engagement with them. I did not discuss the matter with them beforehand. I had an expert panel who looked at a lot of the detail they gave. I did not implement all of the recommendations of the panel, but I cut the period very significantly because we must have the acceleration of the green energy transition.
Minister, you said yourself last week, and I'll quote, Eskom has consistently failed to meet minimum emission standards and has delayed critical energy reforms, end quote. And you basically said that now again. Do you have any reason to believe that they'll actually stick to the deadlines you've given them now? And in 5 years' time, I mean, you may be the Minister of the Environment, you may not. 5 years' time is a term. Aren't they just going to do it again?
Well, the thing is, as I said, I can, at any stage, I can actually amend those exemptions. So I can actually switch off a power station. Now, of course, we don't want to have that happening because we don't want to have load shedding. But it is possible to do that, and to do that with a small station. But if I'd done that with one, we would have ended up with one stage. But the crucial point that I'm making is that we have a new government now. There is, in fact, political will to hold Eskom to account. Certainly in terms of the articulation of my colleague also on energy and electricity, Minister Ramaphosa, we are similar mind, and the Government of National Unity is too, is that we must accelerate the energy transition. We have the Climate Change Act now. We also have our international obligations. So the political will is now different, because it is so that there were conditions put to Eskom previously and they just ignored them. But the game is different now. And as I said, I've made very tight deadlines for the health interventions. And so if Eskom does not meet them, I will actually sit down with them and I will make it clear as to what I'm going to then do. I do not want to hurt South Africans, because obviously if your lights are out, it makes a huge big impact. But at the same time, we do want clean air for our young children who have lung problems and get cleft palates on birth because of the air that their mothers are breathing. So these are things that must be attended to.
There are lots of different ways to look at this, and in some ways, one of the trade-offs could be, so there's a financial trade-off, but one of the ways would be a different trade-off, which would be the excess deaths caused by the pollution in certain areas. On some measures, parts of Mpumalanga have the second worst air quality in the world. The number of excess deaths, the number of people who've died who would not have died, but have died because of the pollution, would be X. But load shedding, as I'm sure you would be allowed to say in this conversation, load shedding brings excess deaths of its own. More people die during load shedding than without it. Did your panel look at that? Because that would perhaps be, I hate to say it, but one way to inform the trade-off.
Well, I think what the crucial thing is, what the panel did was it sat down and said, if we're going to try and get some kind of a balance going here, what kind of time frame do we look at, and what type of interventions are required? Because a lot of work needs to be done. Because remember, there's particulate matter, which is the ash, then there is the sulfur dioxide, and then there's the oxides of nitrogen. So there are different kinds of pollutants, and some are slightly worse than others. And that mitigation of that is a different process, and it costs different amounts of money. So we did look at that. But what the crucial thing is, what we were looking at clearly is, how do we ensure that Eskom actually complies and does do what it's supposed to do? In my ruling, I was very clear about the independent power producers, about the grid, that the transmission lines that need to be speeded up, and also that they should not be imposing taxes on solar panels, etc. So also what I have instructed them to do is to measure the air immediately and make sure that they have an app that informs the population so people know that when the atmosphere is worse than regular, because it does happen that way, they can then take evasive action, for example. That's just one of the things. Also, the greening, that they must plant green in the communities that they are polluting. So that there are those mitigation. They're more softer mitigation ones, but I'll be able to monitor those in the short run and then see. Eskom has said that they want to comply. And so I want to give them the opportunity to do that.
Minister, it's very easy to conflate issues in electricity. As you well know, it's a very complex and technical space. You make the point that Eskom cannot levy taxes on solar. I don't want to confuse that. Last week we heard that Eskom wanted to impose let me call it a registration or a compliance fee of around 30,000 Rand on people who had installed solar in their own homes. These would be direct Eskom customers. You're not referring to that, right?
I am basically saying to Eskom that there is no reason at all that they must disincentivize people from moving off the grid and going green, because they are a monopoly and they're unable to deliver the electricity. So it doesn't make any sense for them to hold South Africans to ransom. So I'm talking about any additional costs to consumers who have actually spent their own money to get off the grid. In fact, it should relieve the pressure on Eskom. So that is a perverse thing, and it is unacceptable. I've made it very clear. And what I will do is I will use every power that I have to make sure that they don't burden South Africans more. They do need to change their behavior, and I want to give them the opportunity to do that.
We have, I think you know, there's quite an active environmental legal lobby in this country. We actually have a Centre for Environmental Rights. It would seem to me that they're likely to be listening to you this evening. They'll be going, along with Eskom, going through the record of the decision. Are you confident this will survive a legal bid in court?
Well, like I said today when I did my announcement, is that the recourse, obviously, of Eskom is they can actually take me to court on, to have this decision reviewed. And I say what I like to do is, because we do get sued regularly in the department, what I like to do is to have a conversation before and try to make some kind of agreement that would avoid court, because it's expensive and, why do we have to do that? But if I go to court, I intend to win. I do believe that this will stand up in court. And the period is short. It is true. 5 years is not a long time. They asked for a lot more, and they did present reasons for that, etc. But having a close look at their financial situation, at the capacity on the grid, etc., the fact that they reserve grid capacity, they don't have to do that. I believe that if they do take the matter to court on review, I do think that I would win that case. If that's the case, well, then we must go there. But they've not said that, and I certainly don't want to put any words in their mouths. But I think it's crystal clear what I've said today. And as I said, I am going to be now having a conversation with Eskom to talk about their compliance, and that we want to work together on this because we want to get it done.
You refer to independent power producers. Now, you're the Minister of Environment in this decision. What power do you have to say to Eskom they must use or enable IPPs?
Well, I am responsible for the Climate Change Act. It's now it's been proclaimed, so there's that. Also, we have the Paris Agreement that South Africa has signed up to, and also in the medium-term development plan, my department is responsible for the lower carbon environment. So I am responsible to bring down the emissions, and that is my remit, and that is why I am absolutely certain that it is within my domain. What my department has also done is we have looked very closely at our environmental impact assessment process to make sure that where it's a low impact on the environment, for example, we can speed up the applications that are made for the transmission lines and for the projects. So we are doing that. We are clearing the way for these projects to happen. Also, my colleague, the Minister of Energy and Electricity, he is committed to getting the projects done. And so I certainly don't intend to stand in the way. Obviously, we must look at the environment, etc. But as I say, we've got corridors now that we've identified where we can speed up with the transmission line. So just Eskom must not reserve that space because, they're not doing anything in the space anyway. So it is my remit, and I do believe that if it is taken to court, for example, I don't think that they would win that because we have made it very clear it's government policy and we want to make sure we can get this done. So I do think that they have every reason to comply.
Minister, I hope you don't mind. I don't mean to ambush you, but we do have a question for you, if that's all right. It's from John in Craighall Park. John, good evening. You're with Minister Dion George. Go for it.
Yes, good evening to you and to Minister. Minister, the question is follows. If a privately owned coal-fired power station were to make a similar application, would you grant it?
I would have to consider what the application was. So every single application has a process. It is true that it whoever applies to the department, I'd consider what they are asking for and what the circumstances are, and then I would make a decision on that basis.
Minister, I really do appreciate the time tonight. John, thank you for your call. Minister, before you go, you're allowed to shout the word ambush at me. Are you confident of a budget this week?
I am confident, yes.
Minister, thank you. Dr. Dion George is the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, of course, with the Democratic Alliance, on the line to you tonight on The Money Show. 22 minutes after 7.
The Money Show.
Business books.
Well, do you ever feel that the way people behave is more selfish than it used to be? That younger people are actually less thoughtful of others, more selfish, more demanding of others than they used to be? Well, strangely, it may not just be because they're so young and you're so mature. In fact, there's some economic evidence that you may be right. Some of the answers may be in a book. It's called License to be Bad, How Economics Corrupted Us, by Jonathan Eldred, and Bronwyn Williams, trend translator and future finance specialist of Flux Trends, has been looking at this. Bronwyn, I may be growing more mature when I say this sounds enticing. I like to be told my generation is less selfish than other generations. What case does this book make?
This book is less a case really about selfishness. It is about criticism of some of the economic models that we follow, from things like nudge-based economics all the way through to criticizing ideas like GDP, which people love to do. But it's really criticizing the ways that we are both using economics normatively and positively to try and influence and also describe people's behavior. And the bit that you've picked up on there with selfishness refers to how nudge economics, remember that famous book that came out with Kastanstein and Co., it's been adopted by various different presidencies who want to be able to manipulate the population into behaving better, for example, that inadvertently some of those nudges could have actually made our behavior worse and more selfish over time rather than better and more virtuous as they purported to do.
I mean, what's been happening in economics that has made this happen? You'll have to explain a bit more about nudge economics to me, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so economics in general, I think people criticize it because although it's supposed to be a descriptive science first and foremost, it has become quite prescriptive too. And quite often the prescription or the description can actually end up changing the reality that we operate in that, of course, that the numbers and the models that economists put out to try and guide economies also change our behaviors too. So nudge economics, for those of you who aren't familiar with nudge or behavioral economics, as you might have heard it, and some people have also tried to include behavioral linguistics into that conversation too, are all about kind of a intersection of economics and psychology. It was made famous by some economists and sociologists that wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow. Again, some of your listeners might remember that. It's all about how we frame choices can influence the choices that people make. And the central claim around nudge economics or behavioral economics is that people are inherently irrational, and that a wise or benevolent policymaker can influence that rationality to make people make better choices, if you want to put it that way, by changing semantics or by changing the way incentives are presented to people. So it's supposed to be, as the proponents or the inventors of the term nudge put it, a kind of benign paternalism.
Do you buy
so benign, the premise in this book?
Do you buy the thesis? I mean, do you think it's right? I mean, the way in which we the influences that we are under seem to have changed fundamentally in the last generation. I mean, you could say that for many generations, but I think more so in the last 20 years than before.
Yeah. So one of the cases that's looked at in this book is how nudge policy was used, for example, to get people to do things like, the classic example is invest more in their retirement funds, which is obviously a social good if you've got less people that are destitute when they're elderly, or to encourage people that might be a bit closer to current thinking, to encourage people to do things like get vaccinations, or to do nice things, or to like stop littering, for example. It's all these sorts of things that you can employ nudge-based policies to get an economic good for the policymaker, but by influencing people's behaviors, by changing, as I said, the way that things are either incentivized or perceived to be incentivized. So where we get to the question of the selfishness point that you mentioned, one of the things that has been found is that paying people to do good, like, for example, bribing people to take vaccines, which is in itself a social good at the end, can actually reduce people's uptake of doing that good thing just out of their own free will. Because as soon as you put a price onto it, people start saying, oh, I will only do it if I get paid. Whereas before they could have been persuaded through logic and through politics and through more discursive channels. As soon as you try and price doing good or doing social good, you can get people to do a bit more in the short term, but in the long term, you can actually end up undermining the very policy that you were trying to support.
Presumably, somewhere in this book is maybe the beginnings or the sort of germination of a set of ideas to modify behavior in a more positive form.
Yeah, I think actually the book probably goes in the opposite direction. It says that maybe we shouldn't be trying to modify people's behaviors because we end up creating all of these perverse incentives, and that perhaps treating people like people rather than treating people like formulas that you can put something in and then you're going to get something else might actually be the more sustainable way to get better long-term results for larger groups of people in the long term, which is of course the hard road. So it's basically saying that quite a lot of these shortcuts that the wise and benevolent policymakers and the smart, much smarter than you, the subtext sort of economists and other sociologists that think that they can get people to make better decisions than people can on their own, might actually have to go back to the drawing board when they start to consider that human beings are not quite the same things as AI or like machines that can be programmed, but programming people is a bit harder in practice than it is in theory. So the basic premise of this book is that a lot of things that sound good in theory, where the math checks out, don't actually check out when you put it to play among people.
Bronwyn Williams, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Trend translator and future finance specialist at Flux Trends.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Just a moment to reflect, if I may, on what Dr. Dion George, the Minister of Environment, said about Eskom and solar power. And you may remember the conversation we had with Chris Yelland last week. We were going through the fact that Eskom is looking at charging a sort of compliance or registration fee of around 30,000 Rand per person, per direct customer who has a solar installation on their property. Yelland believed, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if I understood him correctly, that it's very hard to justify that. I have to say I completely agree with him and would perhaps go further and suggest that people are not going to pay that. They're just going to leave the Eskom grid forever. So interesting to hear the Environment Affairs Minister does come from the DA, I should remind you, suggesting that in fact he will do whatever he can to make sure that Eskom incentivizes people to use those kind of solutions. I do wonder if there is scope for Eskom policy on this to change. And while Eskom, I suspect, is going to find that there is a lot of public pressure, I wouldn't be surprised if other organizations get involved. I wouldn't be surprised if political parties turn this into some kind of warfare in one way or another. But still, perhaps an important comment from Dion George tonight around Eskom and how it is treating its customers who are on solar installations.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
Well, you know, there's a loud group of voices in our society. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with me when I say that. But you will hear people talking about some of the complicated issues that emerge around business and race. And one of the voices you'll hear pretty often in these discussions is the CEO of the Black Business Council, Hankie Matabane. And he's in your studio now. Hankie, good evening. Thanks so much for coming into the Money Show studio tonight.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. And thank you very much for welcoming me with that big picture.
I mean, I remember when the Black Business Council was started. Sanzile Zungu, what we've spoken to him, he was in charge at the time. And for the first time, it seemed to me that black business as an organization was becoming to be really important because it was a lobbying in the ANC. We'd never seen that before. I'm talking like 2012, around then. And it's been interesting to watch the council's progress over that time.
We are still mainly a lobbying organization, lobbying for policy. You'll see us meeting basically everyone in South Africa. We've met during the SONA, we've met the DA. Some people were unhappy. We've met with the Sakeli Kha. We met with the Free Forum. We've met.
Sorry, I didn't see it.
So because when you lobby, you have to meet everyone because you need to make everyone understand what you are doing and how you are doing it, so that you can influence. Because our intention is to make sure that there's a diversity of views in South Africa, and once you consider the diversity of all the views, you are likely to come up with a better solution for South Africa.
So I went through your LinkedIn experiences, right? And there's time at City Power. We won't spend too much time on that tonight. There's time at Centec. There's time at Business Unity South Africa. There's time at the Black Business Council. The first job I could find was the Galema High School. And after that, you went to Wits. What were you doing before the Galema High School is my question. Where were you growing up? What kind of community?
I come from a community called Magurung Rampatlele in Limpopo. And that's basically where I spent my 17 years, because I did my matric at 17. I was almost always the youngest in matric. But I don't think I was problematic at a young age. And yeah, I spent a few years not doing anything, mainly because we didn't have money at home. Yeah. And hence I went to Galema High School to teach for a year. And what I did with that money, I basically saved all the money. And that's the money that then I used to pay for my first year. And then from there, I was fortunate enough to get the bursaries, and I've been on bursaries since then. And my sort of second job was at, can you mention the names of things?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was a shop assistant at Starterfords in Eastgate.
Wow.
And hence when Starterfords was closed, my heart was sore because...
When was that?
I think it was 92. 93, 94.
I was working as a shop assistant in a shop called Telesound, which no longer exists, also in Eastgate, at the same time.
Yeah. So I used to be there like Fridays, evenings, Saturdays, Sunday. And then I think they taught us, that's where I learned a very, very good lesson, that you must not look at how the customer is dressed. When you assist customers, you shouldn't be discriminatory according to how people dress, because people come there wearing shorts and all those things, and they spend a lot of money. So you have to treat customers the same. And I grew up with that, and even up to now, I think that's how I try to treat people. I try to treat people as not as I see them, but I treat them as human beings.
It's interesting how much you can learn on a shop floor.
A lot. Customer service, how to speak to customers, how to always think or treat customers as customers are always right. Even if they are unreasonable, you just have to humble yourself. And that also teaches you that later in life, when you have an interaction with different types of people, you are able to basically have what you call EQ. I think that taught me how to have EQ, how to tolerate people. That's why we can interact with anyone now without being angry, without being emotional, and understand that they are doing their job.
So you'd worked a little bit. You'd had to wait a year or two to get the money. You'd worked as a teacher, and then was Wits the first institution?
No. I went to an institution called Sitlogelo Technikon in Garankuwa. It used to be next to Medunsa. And I did first year there. Second year, it was 1993. And then because that portion in Garankuwa was basically part of what was Butatswana then.
Yeah.
We were on strike most of the time, and then
it's a very difficult time to be a student.
Yeah, and Mangope then said, no, those who don't have student visa, almost like student visa, should not come back. So that's why I didn't go back, and my money had finished by that time. So fortunately, then I had good marks, and then I applied to West Technical, and then that's when I got admitted there, and. At Vestec, I was also a student assistant, so I used to assist students with the computers, and also one thing that I've done there. If you go to the Auckland Park campus of now UJ, you'll find there's a chess place there. I was the one basically who lobbied for it to be there, but unfortunately it was completed when I was not there, so I've never played chess there.
Were you already having a sense of lobbying? I mean, were you already having a sense of trying to improve a space or improve something? So much was happening at the time. I mean, I remember it. I'm a little younger, little less mature than you. But what I do remember for a lot of people was a sense of possibility that had never existed before. You actually might have had the power to change something you couldn't. Were you feeling that already, early 90s, mid-90s?
Yes, but I thought I can only influence through a business, not necessarily politics. So I always shied away from pure politics. I always wanted to be in the politics of business, not the politics of politics, because politics of politics is very shrewd and cruel. But at least politics of business. It's much different, but I always thought there must be a way of making a contribution that is much bigger than yourself. Instead of trying to say I want to be the best in this for myself alone, but I always had that thing. For example, when I was in the village, we started an organization for career guidance, because remember in the villages. It was not everyone who could basically afford to go to town for career guidance, and the teachers for some reason they will choose the kids of the teachers, the kids of the nurses. Maybe they knew they could afford to pay for themselves. So I started a career guidance in the village where we'll invite the vet universities, the companies, big companies from here, to come and do career guidance, and I think that has helped a lot of incoming kids to then discover a lot of careers, because at that time we only had policemen, nurses, doctor. The best was the doctors and teachers, and that's it. So that I think helped me to then say, but no, you can make a bigger contribution. You started from the village making a contribution. You can do it in the province. You can do it national, and I think that basically said to me, but you just like other people, you can find a way of making your own contribution.
You spoke about the politics of business, and you spent some time in state entities, so City Power in Joburg, Centec. Having my own brief history, I would suggest that there's no better way to learn about the politics of business than in a government entity.
I think the government entities depends on many other things. So the bigger the government entity is, the more the problems. Because remember, the majority of the problems that we have in South Africa are as a result of tenders. So if you look at basically all the state institutions, the bigger the state institution, the bigger the tenders, the bigger the interference, the bigger the problems. And you can look at all of them, Transnet, Eskom, Dinel, SAA, all of them. I think it's only mainly the smaller ones who don't have bigger tenders that are doing well. But also hiring the right people also is very important, because then when you hire especially the right board, because sometimes when you get board members who are not achievers themselves, they make life difficult even for executives, only to find that they want the jobs of the executives. So they want you to leave as a CEO so that they can apply for your job, because wherever they are, they haven't achieved, they don't earn that much. Hence, sometimes you find that when you are discussing bonuses of staff members in an SOC, those who are not earning that much, they are comparing their own salaries with the salaries of the staff members. They think, but if this person is earning 5 million, he wants or she wants a 3 million bonus, and where I work, I only get 500,000. So you start to get this jealousy that we have to deal with it one day.
You represent the Black Business Council. I imagine a lot of your members are Black-owned businesses that are independent from government. Do you regret having not much experience in sort of privately owned business at all? I mean, do you find there is a difference between those businesses and what you've seen in SOEs?
Yeah, there is a huge difference. Fortunately, I've been a board member of privately owned companies, so I sort of know how things work. But what I've realized, some of the privately owned businesses, as compared to the SOCs, the board will have more power than the CEO. But in a private company, the way things work, the CEO will have more power than the board, because majority of the board members there are also basically recommended by the CEO. So the CEO actually in a private company runs the show. In a state-owned enterprises, you have to consult with the board. Sometimes the board will have more power, and then I think that's what brings more dynamics. Because if the CEO is in charge, they are able to then determine many things, where things are supposed to go, where would they procure, who gets hired, and that's why in a privately owned company, you can meet someone at the airport and give them a job. In an SOC, you can't, because there are so many processes that, and I think maybe it's because you are using someone else's money. You are using taxpayers' money, so you can't just do things willy-nilly like it's your own money. When it's your own sponsor shop, I can meet you, Stephen, and they say, no, tomorrow come and start.
You're a CEO now. How much power do you have now? But you're the CEO of a council, which makes a slightly different structure.
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated, because you are basically taking mandates from members. And members will have different expectations, because we have members who are like from hand to mouth. We have micro, we've got a medium size, we've got big companies that are members. So their needs are usually very, very, very different. But one thing that is in common is that they want to see South Africa that is growing, South Africa that is transforming, so that our kids, when they grow up, they grow up in the country that everyone else wants to live in.
We're speaking to Hankie Matabane tonight, the Chief Executive Officer of the Black Business Council, talking about his journey through to his position. 9 minutes now to 8.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa CIB, honored as the best research house for the 8th consecutive year at the JSE Spire Awards 2024.
Hankie Matabane is the CEO of the Black Business Council. We're talking about his journey through his career this evening. Hankie, I mean, there's a lot around, and your organization is always involved, sometimes embroiled, in some of the big conversations that we have. I've been, and I remember so clearly, and I was very excited at the time, I was an eyewitness news reporter, when the BBC was formed, because I thought that we would now see a pro-business voice in the ANC, or not in the ANC, that's not quite fair, but we would see a pro-business voice lobbying the ANC directly, and race would be removed from part of it. I mean, you remember 2012, very messy, it still is. And one of the things that you wanted as the Black Business Council was a small business development ministry. And there is a small business development minister. And I mean, she said it somewhere else, but I couldn't believe it when she said that the ministry is a new ministry, a relatively new ministry, and still sorting out its modalities. I mean, it's 10 years old. Has the ministry been effective?
I think it had its own ups and downs, and I think the biggest challenge that it has is it is not properly funded. and it was not also, I think, from a structural point of view, it's not necessarily being put at the center. Because ideally, if you look at other countries in the world, the issues of small business, even though there's a small business ministry or department, they basically the issues of small business become a focus of a government. But unfortunately, in our country, other departments, they run as if nothing is normal. And it's only when maybe someone is talking about unemployment and then they come and say, but small business department. But you are not supposed to box the department and only remember it when you are talking about such things. Ideally, the small business issues are supposed to cut across all the departments, and the department should basically work as an aggregator. And it must have enough power to go to any department to say, but where are your plans? What have you implemented? But the way it's structured is not like that.
I've been surprised by the fact that the current person, Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, and the person before her, Lindiwe Zulu, and I've argued with them both and very scared to argue with either of them. Neither of them have, in my view, this is just my view, I want to hear your view, I have not seen them acting as a cheerleader for small business. I haven't seen them saying, this regulation is bad for small business, or change this to help small business. I realize I don't consume everything they say. I realize that. But I still find there's a curious, almost silence from that department around issues affecting small business. It's not proactive, is my point.
Yeah, maybe there's no coverage, because if you look at the current minister, she did amend the Small Business Development Act. So she did focus on the policy, but maybe I think that there's a need for public relations. On her side.
You sound like you're defending her a little bit.
I'm not.
It sounds like it. Because I ask small business after small business on this program, has the minister done anything for you? And they will say no.
Yeah. I think there are instances, I think, where we could have done better, where she could have done better, or the department could have done better. And again, for me, is to make sure that we lobby for issues that are disturbing or disrupting small business, or disturbing small business from taking the center stage. For example, we've got a big issue of access to funding and access to the markets, and we've been fighting for what we now call the Public Procurement Act, because that act will unlock a lot of opportunities from the state procurement. And one thing that we managed to get is what we call a set-asides. So now you can set aside a certain portion of state procurement for small businesses, and only small businesses will compete for that.
We have unintended consequences. Look at what happened with the construction mafia.
Yeah, I think that one was not handled very well. And we've engaged with the construction mafia people, because we said to them, what you are doing is also short-sighted, because if you're saying here at 702, it's only me who operates, and then you can only build one school here. What happens after that school has been built? It means you can't go and build another school next door, because next door will basically say to you, no, we can't do this. So for us, I think what has lacked from the ministry is that they were absent even during the discussions on the Public Procurement Act, because we needed them to be there, like the DTIC was there, National Treasury obviously, because it's the custodian, was there, and then now we need to then, as we're talking about access to funding, as we're talking about the 100 billion fund that the Minister Pakstau has proposed, small business should be there to basically fight for that, because once you have funding and once you have access to the market, we're going to be able to then grow small businesses to medium and big business. And that will also assist government, because as small businesses grow, they hire people who are on grants. Those people then they get into the economic system, they pay taxes, they get more money than they buy from other companies. That's how you grow the economy.
I deliberately didn't bring out the transformation fund because you and I will have that discussion another day. I sometimes think when it comes to transformation, our society can move slowly and move quickly at the same time. I mean, I remember before Siya Kolisi was appointed Springbok captain, I thought this would be another generation. I don't know if we'll have another white captain, I mean, the numbers tell us often there's not enough transformation in business, but something like 90% of junior bank managers are black. I mean, I think of the big four banks, and Capitec sort of knocking at the door, but the big four, three have black CEOs, one's, black women. Things are moving quite quickly. Do you think there might one day be a time when organizations like the Black Business Council maybe change their name and aren't about race?
Yeah, one day, that's our intention. One day, the Black Business Council should disappear. And we have basically defined that one day to say, once the ownership, the control, the management of the economy reflects the demographics, there won't be a need for the BBC because everything else then will be normal. But unfortunately, that normal may not come in the next 100 years.
Sure. Racialized inequality forces it.
Yeah, looking at the pace. But I agree with you. I think if you've mentioned the banks, I think including the other banks with the zebra as a thing, it also has a black CEO. So there is a progress, but we just need to deepen transformation to an extent that when any of the banks go and procure, we can see procurement happening from black business. When they fund, we can see them funding black businesses. But progress is there. It's slow, but we're getting somewhere. And I think it's because we're busy lobbying for that. But it can't happen by itself if there was no legislation. So it's important that there must be legislation. There must be someone who would then say, let's accelerate economic transformation because it's good for all of us.
Hanki Matabane, you and I have spoken many times. We've never spent as much time together in a studio. I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Hanki Matabane is the CEO of the Black Business Council.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa CIB. Honored as the best research house for the 8th consecutive year at the JSE Spire Awards 2024.